Gerald Watkins was still laughing when the courtroom went silent. Not the nervous, uncomfortable laughter of someone who realizes they have made a mistake, but the deep, rolling, belly-shaking laughter of a man who genuinely believed that nothing in that room could touch him. He sat in the defendant's chair with his thick arms crossed over his chest, his too-tight dress shirt pulling at every button, and he laughed directly into the face of the most feared judge in the history of American television. The audience froze. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively. And Judge Judy Sheindlin, the woman who had demolished 20,000 cases and reduced seasoned attorneys to stammering apologies, did something that nobody in that courtroom expected. She went completely, terrifyingly, absolutely silent. She set her pen down on the desk with the slow, deliberate care of someone who had just made a decision. She folded her hands. And she looked at Gerald Watkins with the kind of eyes that do not blink, do not waver, and do not forgive. That silence lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds that Gerald Watkins would spend the rest of his life wishing he could take back. Because that silence was not confusion. It was not hesitation. It was not a woman searching for words. That silence was the sound of a trap closing around a man who had spent 11 years believing he was too loud, too large, and too clever to ever be caught. He was about to discover, in front of 12 million viewers, exactly how wrong he had been. Every moment of arrogance that had carried him through decades of predatory behavior, every dismissive laugh he had aimed at people too frightened or too exhausted to fight back, every dollar he had extracted from trembling hands and trusting hearts. All of it was about to be laid out on national television with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of someone who has seen this exact cruelty one too many times and has decided, today, that it ends. By the time Judge Judy finished with Gerald Watkins, his contractor's license would be suspended, his business bank accounts would be frozen, 3 separate government agencies would have opened formal investigations into his practices, and his own former employee would hand investigators the spreadsheet he had kept for years, the one he had titled, with staggering arrogance, the retirement fund. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand why that laugh was the single most catastrophic mistake Gerald Watkins ever made, you need to understand who was sitting across from him in that courtroom. You need to understand Dorothy Harmon. Dorothy Harmon was 78 years old. She had spent 41 years teaching 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary School, where she had watched generations of 8-year-olds learn to read, learn to count, learn to treat other people with the basic dignity that she modeled every single day without ever being asked to and without ever being thanked enough. She had been married to Earl Harmon for 53 years, a Korean War veteran who came home quieter than he left and who spent the rest of his life showing his love not in grand gestures but in the careful, daily work of being a good man. When Earl passed, Dorothy was left with a modest house, a lifetime of memories, and $34,000 in savings that she had built over 30 years by clipping coupons, skipping vacations, and putting away whatever small amounts she could because she wanted to leave something for her grandchildren. $34,000 that represented not just money but proof that a life lived with patience and integrity and quiet determination adds up to something real and lasting and worth protecting. Gerald Watkins took all of it in a single afternoon. He drove his truck through Dorothy's neighborhood on the first morning after a heavy rainstorm, the way he always did, scanning houses with the practiced eye of someone who has learned to read vulnerability from the outside of a building. He knocked on her door with a clipboard and a concerned expression and told her he had noticed serious damage to her roof while driving past, the kind of damage, he said, that could lead to a ceiling collapse before the next storm season. He used words like structural integrity and load-bearing compromise and immediate safety risk, and Dorothy, who had trusted people her entire life because she had spent her entire life being worthy of trust, believed him. She wrote him a cashier's check for $34,000 for repairs he had absolutely no intention of completing. Then he left. And he never came back. And when Dorothy called his office number, a woman answered, and when Dorothy explained through tears that her heating system was failing and she needed to know when work would begin, the woman on the other end of the line laughed. And then she hung up. If you believe people who prey on the elderly deserve real consequences, Hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss moments like this, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world people still believe in justice. Dorothy Harmon did not give up quietly. That is the first thing you need to understand about her, because the story of what happened in Judge Judy's courtroom is not just the story of a woman who was wronged. It is the story of a woman who refused to accept that being wronged was the end of it. She filed a police report 3 days after Gerald stopped returning her calls. The officer who took her statement was polite and sympathetic and told her that contract disputes were typically civil matters and that she should consult an attorney. She consulted an attorney. The attorney told her that the legal fees required to pursue the case through civil court would likely exceed what she was owed by the time everything was said and done, and that Gerald's company structure was designed specifically to make recovery difficult. She filed a complaint with the state contractor's licensing board. 8 months passed. She received a form letter acknowledging receipt of her complaint and informing her that investigations of this nature typically took between 12 and 18 months to resolve. By that point, Dorothy had already spent 2 winters in a house with a failing heating system because the $34,000 she had saved to address exactly that kind of problem was gone. She wore her coat and sighed. She used electric blankets her former students had sent after word got around the neighborhood about what had happened to her. She told her grandchildren she was fine. It was her granddaughter Alicia who finally found the way forward. Alicia was 26 years old, sharp and fierce in the way that people become when they have watched someone they love be mistreated and have spent years looking for the right door to kick open. She had driven 3 hours to spend a weekend with Dorothy in January and had arrived to find the house cold, the refrigerator carefully managed to stretch a fixed income that was never designed to absorb a $34,000 theft, and her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table going through the licensing board paperwork for the 4th time as though rereading it might produce a different outcome. Alicia sat down across from her, took her grandmother's hands, and made a promise that she intended to keep regardless of what it required. She researched every available avenue. She found Judge Judy's producer submission line at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and spent 2 hours writing the most detailed, documented, emotionally precise case summary she had ever produced, attaching every piece of evidence Dorothy had carefully preserved: the contract, the cashier's check carbon, the call logs, the unanswered emails, the licensing board acknowledgement letter, the police report number. She submitted it and then she sat in her car in Dorothy's driveway and cried for 15 minutes because sometimes fighting as hard as you can still feels like it might not be enough. Judge Judy's production team called Dorothy 4 days later. Meanwhile, Gerald Watkins was having what he considered an excellent winter. Watkins Home Solutions was operating across a territory that now spanned portions of 3 states, and Gerald had refined his system to a level of efficiency that he privately found impressive. He had learned, over 11 years of practice, exactly which neighborhoods to target, the ones with older housing stock and aging populations, the ones where a man with a truck and a clipboard and a confident voice could project the kind of authority that made people reach for their checkbooks before their skepticism. He had learned the precise language of manufactured urgency, the specific combination of technical vocabulary and sympathetic concern that bypassed rational evaluation and spoke directly to fear. He had learned that the window between the initial knock and the signed contract was ideally less than 40 minutes, because beyond 40 minutes people started calling their children or their neighbors, and second opinions were the enemy of his business model. He had learned that cash and cashier's checks were preferable to credit cards because disputes were harder to initiate, and that structuring his company with a rotating series of LLC designations made it difficult for any single complaint to accumulate into a pattern that regulators could act on efficiently. He had, by his own internal accounting, successfully extracted deposits from 23 clients who received either no work or work so inadequate it caused additional damage. The total across 11 years was just over $400,000. He kept detailed records. Not because he felt any obligation toward accuracy, but because he was, in his own estimation, a businessman, and businessmen kept records. He maintained a spreadsheet on a password-protected laptop that cataloged each client by a nickname he had assigned based on some detail he remembered from the initial visit. Dorothy Harmon was listed in that spreadsheet as schoolteacher, full pull, no return. The column next to her entry showed $34,000. The column after that showed 0, representing the amount of work completed. Gerald had never once looked at that 0 and felt anything resembling discomfort. He prepared for his Judge Judy appearance with the same methodical confidence he brought to everything. He told his wife it would be a minor inconvenience and good television. He selected his clothing carefully, nothing too expensive, nothing that would signal the financial success he had built on other people's savings. He practiced looking confused and saddened by Dorothy's accusations, rehearsing expressions of genuine bewilderment that he believed were convincing. He had decided his central argument would be that Dorothy was an elderly woman whose memory had become unreliable, that she had agreed to a specific scope of work that was completed satisfactorily, and that her dissatisfaction stemmed from confusion rather than fraud. He had used variations of this argument before, with the contractors board and in one previous small claims case, and it had worked both times because the people evaluating his claims had not yet seen what Judge Judy's research team had been quietly assembling for 6 weeks. Because here is what Gerald did not know and could not have anticipated. Judge Judy's producers had not just reviewed Dorothy's case in isolation. They had pulled every public record associated with Watkins Home Solutions across all 3 states of operation. They had contacted the contractors' licensing boards in each state and requested the full complaint histories. They had found Harold Burke in one city and Patricia Sims in another, and they had found 14 additional complainants through a combination of public records, local news archives, and a community Facebook group that Dorothy's neighbor had started after hearing what happened, a group that had grown to over 200 members in 6 weeks as people who had been too ashamed or too exhausted to pursue formal complaints found each other for the first time. They had located Gerald's former office manager, a woman named Cheryl Dawson who had quit after 18 months because she could not stomach what she was watching happen, and who had kept notes. Specific, dated, detailed notes. And a copy of the spreadsheet. Gerald walked into that courtroom believing he was facing a confused old woman and a television judge with no real authority. He was actually walking into 6 weeks of preparation, 3 states of documented evidence, and the full attention of a woman who had spent 25 years on the family court bench in New York developing an instinct for predators that had never once failed her. The moment Gerald settled into the defendant's chair and looked around the courtroom with the easy confidence of a man who had never paid a real price for anything, Judge Judy was already watching him. And what she saw confirmed everything her research had told her. The gold watch that cost more than Dorothy's monthly pension. The way he glanced at Dorothy with something that was not quite contempt but lived in the same neighborhood. The micro-expression of amusement that crossed his face when the bailiff announced the case amount, as though $34,000 was a figure too small to be taken seriously by a man of his experience. Judge Judy had seen that expression before. She had seen it on the faces of men who confused the absence of consequences with the absence of accountability. She had spent 35 years explaining the difference. She was about to explain it again, in front of 12 million people, in a way that Gerald Watkins would never recover from. Dorothy Harmon smoothed her skirt one final time before the proceedings began, a small, careful gesture that nobody in the courtroom noticed except Judge Judy, who noticed everything. Dorothy had dressed as though this were the most important day of her life, because for her it was. She wore the navy blue blazer she had kept in her closet for 41 years of parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings, the one that Earl had always said made her look like someone worth listening to. She had organized her folder of documents with color-coded tabs, each section labeled in the same precise handwriting she had used on 30 years of third-grade report cards. She had brought one personal item that was not evidence, a photograph of herself and Earl taken on their 50th anniversary, the two of them standing in front of the rose garden he had planted in their backyard over the course of a decade, one bush at a time, because Earl believed that beautiful things were worth the patience they required. She had placed the photograph at the corner of the table where she could see it without looking away from the proceedings, and she touched it once before Judge Judy entered the room, The way a person touches something sacred before walking into a situation that requires more courage than they are certain they possess. Gerald's entrance was a performance of calculated humility that fooled nobody who was paying attention. He had replaced the gold watch with a simple digital one. He had chosen a plain blue shirt and khaki pants that were designed to communicate the image of a working man rather than the reality of someone who had extracted over $400,000 from vulnerable people across 3 states. He pulled out Dorothy's chair as he passed her on the way to his seat, a gesture so transparently theatrical that it landed with all the authenticity of a stage prop, and Dorothy moved her folder slightly away from him in response. The way a person moves their belongings away from something they do not trust without wanting to make a scene about it. Gerald settled into his chair and arranged his own folder of documents, a thin collection compared to Dorothy's, with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the outcome of this proceeding had already been determined in his favor. Judge Judy entered and the room reorganized itself around her authority the way rooms always did. She reviewed the case file for a moment in silence, and then she looked up at Gerald with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that experienced court watchers recognized as the most dangerous version of her attention. Her opening questions were conversational in tone and devastating in design. She asked Gerald about his business, how long he had been operating, what services he offered, what geographic area he covered, how many employees he had. Gerald answered with growing ease, the questions feeling familiar enough to relax him into the kind of expansive answering that people do when they believe a conversation is going well. He talked about his 11 years of experience, his commitment to serving homeowners, his team of skilled contractors, his dedication to quality work. He used the word community 3 times in 4 sentences. Judge Judy listened without interrupting, her pen making occasional notes, her expression giving nothing away. Then she asked about his licensing. Gerald confirmed he was fully licensed and insured in his primary state of operation. Judge Judy nodded and reached for the contract Dorothy had provided. She held it up and asked Gerald if he recognized it. He confirmed that he did. She asked him to read aloud the section describing the scope of work agreed upon for Dorothy Harmon's property. Gerald read it with confidence: roof inspection, repair of damaged sections, replacement of compromised flashing, gutter realignment, and a written completion report to be delivered within 60 days of deposit receipt. He read it clearly and without hesitation, the way someone reads a document they are not afraid of, and Judge Judy let him finish completely before she spoke again. She then asked him to find and read the insurance verification clause on page 3. Gerald turned to page 3. His reading slowed almost imperceptibly. The clause required that proof of current liability insurance be attached to every contract as a physical exhibit, with the policy number and provider name clearly stated. The insurance information listed on Gerald's contract showed a policy number and a provider name that Judge Judy had already verified did not match any active policy in the state database. The provider, Consolidated Contractors Insurance Group, had ceased operations in 2019 after its parent company was dissolved following a fraud investigation in another state. Gerald read the clause and stopped. Judge Judy waited with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. Gerald said the insurance information represented the provider he had been working with at the time the contract was signed and that there may have been an administrative transition he was not immediately aware of. Judge Judy set her pen down. She looked at Gerald with an expression that had moved from professionally neutral to something colder and more precise. She told him that an administrative transition was a description she found interesting when applied to a company that had not legally existed for 4 years at the time his contract with Dorothy Harmon was signed. She told him that signing a contract with fraudulent insurance information was not an administrative matter. It was a legal one. Gerald's attorney leaned forward and whispered something. Gerald nodded and said that he would need to review his records more carefully to speak to the specific details of his insurance documentation. Judge Judy told him that was fine and that she had already reviewed those records for him and would be sharing what she found in a moment. Then she turned to Dorothy and asked her to describe, in her own words, what happened after she signed the contract and handed over the cashier's check. Dorothy spoke quietly and without drama, which made everything she said land harder than theatrics ever could. She described the first week of waiting, during which she assumed work would begin and felt the particular relief of someone who believes a problem is being handled. She described the second week, during which she called the office number on the contract twice and was told both times that Gerald was in the field and would return her call. He did not return her calls. She described the third week, during which she called 4 times and reached a voicemail that was eventually full and stopped accepting messages. She described the moment in the fourth week when she drove to the address listed on the contract as the business office and found a commercial mailbox facility with no physical office space, only a mailbox number that corresponded to the suite number on Gerald's letterhead. She described coming home from that drive and sitting at her kitchen table for a long time before she allowed herself to fully understand what had happened to her. She described calling the office number one final time the following morning, reaching a live person, explaining through tears that she was a 78-year-old woman on a fixed income whose heating system needed repair and whose savings were now gone, and asking simply whether anyone could tell her when the work would begin or whether her deposit could be returned. She described the laughter on the other end of the line. She delivered this detail with the same quiet, factual precision she had used for everything else, not for effect but because it was true, and Dorothy Harmon had spent 78 years believing that truth deserved to be spoken plainly regardless of how uncomfortable it made the room. The courtroom absorbed the detail of that laughter in complete silence. Gerald looked at the table. His attorney looked at the ceiling. Judge Judy looked at Gerald with the expression of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. Judge Judy returned to her folder and produced a second document, a compiled record of complaints filed against Watkins Home Solutions across all 3 states of operation, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by client age, deposit amount, and outcome. She set it on the desk and told Gerald she would like to ask him about the pattern it represented. Gerald said he was aware that some clients had expressed dissatisfaction and that disputes were a normal part of operating a contracting business in a competitive market. Judge Judy looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said that 23 documented complaints spanning 11 years and $412,000 in unearned deposits was a description she would not personally characterize as normal. She said she would characterize it as a business model. And then she asked Gerald the question that would trigger the laugh that would end everything. She asked it quietly, almost gently, the way a person asks a question they already know the answer to. She looked at him across the desk and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent courtroom, "Mr. Watkins, what you have described to this court is not a home repair business. It is a retirement fund extraction operation with a truck and a clipboard. Would you like to tell me which part of that description you feel is inaccurate?" Gerald Watkins looked at Judge Judy. And then Gerald Watkins laughed. The laugh filled the courtroom the way smoke fills a room, quickly, completely, and in a way that made it suddenly difficult to breathe. It was not the laugh of someone caught off guard by an unexpected turn of phrase. It was not nervous laughter or the involuntary response of someone processing information faster than their composure could manage. It was the laugh of a man who had spent 11 years being the most powerful person in every room he entered, the laugh of someone who had looked at $34,000 taken from a retired schoolteacher and felt nothing, the laugh of a person who had survived 23 complaints and $400,000 in stolen deposits without a single meaningful consequence and had concluded from that survival not that he had been lucky but that he was untouchable. It rolled out of Gerald Watkins in waves, his shoulders shaking, his chest heaving, his thick arms still crossed as though the entire proceeding were an elaborate joke being performed for his private amusement. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds would define the rest of his life. Dorothy Harmon's hand went to her mouth. It was a small movement, barely visible to the cameras, but it captured everything. The particular pain of someone who has already been robbed once and is now watching the person who robbed her laugh about it in the one place that was supposed to be safe. Alicia, seated directly behind her grandmother in the gallery, closed her eyes for 2 full seconds, and her jaw tightened in the way that people's jaws tighten when they are deciding between rage and composure, and choosing composure because the person sitting in front of them needs them to be steady. The bailiff straightened almost imperceptibly. Several audience members exchanged glances with the wide-eyed, disbelieving expression of people witnessing something they will describe in detail for years. And Judge Judy sat perfectly, absolutely, completely still. She did not flinch. She did not raise an eyebrow. She did not shift in her chair or look away or reach for her gavel or change her expression in any way that would give Gerald Watkins the satisfaction of knowing his laughter had produced a reaction in her. She simply waited for it to finish with the patience of someone who has decided exactly what she is going to do next and is under no pressure whatsoever to begin before she is ready. When the last wave of Gerald's laughter had subsided and he was wiping the corner of his eye with the back of his hand in the casual way of someone who has just heard a genuinely good joke, Judge Judy spoke. Her voice had dropped to a register that regular viewers of the program recognized immediately and experienced court observers described privately as the voice she used when she had stopped deciding whether to destroy someone and had started deciding how completely. "Did something I say amuse you, Mr. Watkins?" The question was 6 words. It was delivered without inflection, without accusation, without any of the emotional coloring that would have made it easier for Gerald to respond to or deflect. It was the question itself stripped of everything except its meaning, and its meaning landed in the silent courtroom with the weight of something that cannot be taken back. Gerald's smile had not entirely disappeared yet. The residue of his laughter was still present in his expression, and it was that residue, that last faint trace of amusement still visible on his face as he formulated his response, that would cost him more than anything else that happened in that room. Because it confirmed, for every person watching, that the laugh had not been accidental and was not regretted. It confirmed that Gerald Watkins, sitting 3 feet away from a 78-year-old woman whose retirement savings he had stolen, found the description of what he had done to her genuinely funny. He said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, you're describing my business like it's some kind of scheme. I'm just a contractor. I can't control what old ladies do with their money." The phrase landed in the courtroom like a grenade with the pin already pulled. What old ladies do with their money. 7 words that managed to simultaneously dismiss Dorothy's agency in being deceived, reduce her to a demographic category rather than a human being, and reframe his active predation as her passive foolishness. The audience reacted with an audible collective intake of breath that was closer to a gasp than anything else. Alicia stood up from her seat before catching herself and sitting back down, her hands gripping the railing in front of her. Dorothy did not gasp and did not stand and did not make any visible dramatic response. She simply straightened her spine, the way a person straightens their spine when they have decided that the only thing they have full control over in this moment is their own dignity and they intend to exercise that control completely. She touched the photograph of herself and Earl once, briefly, and then she folded her hands on the table and looked straight ahead. Judge Judy rose from her chair. It was a slow, deliberate movement that silenced every remaining murmur in the room. In 35 years of television, she had stood from her chair during active proceedings fewer than a dozen times, and every person in that courtroom and every experienced viewer watching at home understood immediately that what was about to happen had moved beyond the boundaries of a routine case. She stood to her full height and she looked at Gerald Watkins with an expression that contained no anger in the way that most people understand anger. It contained something older and colder and more absolute than anger, the expression of someone who has decided that what is happening in front of them is not acceptable and who possesses the authority, the preparation, and the complete lack of hesitation required to end it. "What old ladies do with their money," she repeated, and the way she repeated it, slowly, with precise, deliberate spacing between each word, transformed the phrase from Gerald's casual dismissal into an indictment read aloud for the record. "Dorothy Harmon is not a category, Mr. Watkins. She is a woman who spent 41 years teaching other people's children how to be decent human beings. She saved $34,000 over 30 years by living carefully and honestly and with the kind of patience that people like you have never once been required to develop because you have spent 11 years taking the results of other people's patience and calling it your income. She opened the thick folder that had been sitting at the corner of her desk since the beginning of the proceedings, the one with the yellow tab, and she removed a single sheet of paper that she held up so that Gerald could see it clearly. "Do you know what this is?" Gerald looked at the paper. Something changed in his expression. It was subtle enough that most people in the room did not catch it, but the cameras caught it, and Judge Judy caught it, because Judge Judy had been watching for exactly that change since the moment he walked through the door. It was the expression of a man who has just recognized something he thought was hidden and has realized, for the first time, that it is not. His attorney leaned forward. Gerald shook his head slightly and said he did not recognize the document. Judge Judy told him to look more carefully. She told him it was a sworn affidavit from a former employee of Watkins Home Solutions, a woman who had worked as his office manager for 18 months before resigning because she could not continue to be present for what she was witnessing. She told him that this former employee had provided not just her testimony but documentation. Specific, dated, detailed documentation. Including, she paused here for precisely the length of time required to ensure that every person in the room was holding their breath, a copy of a password-protected spreadsheet that she had photographed from Gerald's own laptop during a moment when it was left unattended in the office. A spreadsheet that cataloged 23 clients by nickname, deposit amount, and a column Gerald had titled Work Completed, in which every single entry read 0. Gerald's attorney was on his feet immediately with an objection about the legality of the document's acquisition. Judge Judy looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had anticipated this objection and prepared for it thoroughly. She told him that the affidavit had been reviewed by her legal team and that the circumstances of the document's acquisition had been evaluated and did not compromise its admissibility in the context of these proceedings. She told him to sit down. He sat down. She returned her attention to Gerald with the focused intensity of someone who has removed the last obstacle between themselves and what they came to do. She read from the spreadsheet. She read every entry. All 23 of them. She read the nicknames Gerald had assigned to his victims, the casual, cruel shorthand of a man who had so thoroughly dehumanized the people he was stealing from that he had reduced them to 2 or 3 word descriptors in a database. She read the deposit amounts next to each name. She read the zeros in the work completed column one by one, and each zero landed in the courtroom like a separate verdict. When she reached Dorothy's entry, schoolteacher, full pull, no return, she stopped. She looked up from the spreadsheet at Gerald. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, full pull. That's what you called it. Full pull. As though taking everything a 78-year-old woman had saved over 30 years was a technical achievement worth noting with a term that makes it sound efficient and professional. She set the spreadsheet down on the desk. You didn't just steal her money, Mr. Watkins. You cataloged it. You were proud of it. And then you sat in my courtroom and laughed about it. Gerald Watkins had stopped looking at Judge Judy. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who has finally understood that the room he is sitting in is not the room he thought he walked into, and that the door he came through no longer opens from the inside. If Judge Judy just said exactly what you've been thinking, hit that like button, subscribe for more courtroom justice, and tell me your city in the comments. Let's see how far this reaches. Judge Judy was not finished. She called forward 2 additional witnesses, Harold Burke, 81, who lost $19,000, and Patricia Sims, 74, who sold her car to cover heating bills after Gerald vanished with her savings. Each testimony landed harder than the last. Gerald's attorney attempted to have both witnesses removed as irrelevant. Judge Judy silenced him with 4 words, sit down, counselor. Now. Gerald sat motionless, the spreadsheet still visible on the desk, his manufactured confidence completely and permanently gone. The courtroom was no longer watching a case. They were watching a man finally, irreversibly, face everything he had spent 11 years running from. Judge Judy's gavel came down like the closing of a door that would never open again. Gerald Watkins was ordered to pay Dorothy Harmon $49,000 immediately. 3 government agencies received formal referrals before the day ended. His contractor's license was suspended within 72 hours. His business accounts were frozen. 12 additional victims came forward after the broadcast aired. Dorothy sat quietly after the verdict, reached for Earl's photograph, and whispered, "We got there, Earl." The courtroom heard it. Gerald heard it. America heard it. Gerald had laughed in Judge Judy's face. Justice laughed last. If Dorothy's story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss when justice wins, and drop your city in the comments right now. Let's fill this section with people who still believe that decency matters.